1891, Missouri. The Girl Who Heard Voices. Until the wind brought the one who whispered her name. Under the dim light of an oil lamp, the wind carried the faint hum of something that was not quite music, not quite human. Missouri, 1891. The air was thick with the scent of rain and soil, but in the attic of the Claiborne estate, a young girl named Eliza sat motionless, her eyes wide and glassy, as if she were listening to a sermon only she could hear. They said she could hear voices, whispers that seeped through the cracks of the wooden walls long after midnight. Some called her touched by the divine, others cursed by the damned. Eliza's story began like many forgotten tales of the South, buried under dust, shame, and silence. But what she heard wasn't the sound of madness. It was something that would unravel the sins of an entire household. Tonight, her secret is no longer locked away. Tonight, you'll hear what the wind carried to her ears. And by the end, you'll understand why her name was never supposed to be spoken again. Imagine the creak of the old floors, the smell of candle wax melting slow, the echo of a chain striking somewhere below the house. Every sound had meaning here, every silence a warning. Eliza would press her small hand to the wall and whisper, "I hear them again." Those words froze the blood of everyone who lived within those walls. Because the Claiborne estate had a history whispered in the dark but never dared spoken aloud. This isn't just a ghost story, it's a story of injustice buried beneath polished wood and holy hymns, of lives stolen and voices that refused to fade. Some said the girl was gifted, others said she was haunted, but one thing was certain, what she heard was real. And when she began repeating the names of the dead, names no living person should have known, the entire town began to fear the sound of the wind. Stay until the end of this story, and you'll uncover the truth no one dared to write down. A truth hidden beneath Missouri soil, in a place where the cries of the past were smothered by power and pride. This is not merely about what Eliza heard, it's about who whispered her name and why the wind still carries it to this day. If you're drawn to forgotten dark histories, where truth and horror intertwine, then you're exactly where you should be. Because before this story ends, a final revelation, one never spoken publicly, will surface. And trust me, when you hear it, you'll never listen to the wind the same way again. Missouri, 1891. A land divided between what was remembered and what was conveniently forgotten. The Civil War had ended decades before, yet the ghosts of that conflict lingered in every town square, in every hymn sung on a Sunday morning. Plantations that once thrived on the backs of enslaved people now stood as hollow monuments, their walls heavy with unspoken sins. The Claiborne estate was one such place, grand, decaying, and steeped in shadows that even daylight could not cleanse. The Claibornes were known throughout Boone County as pious, God-fearing folk. But beneath the polished sermons and Sunday smiles, their legacy was tangled in something far darker. It was said that the estate's foundations were built over an old hideaway, a labyrinth of tunnels once used to smuggle human lives seeking freedom. Others whispered it was used for something else, rituals, punishments, and the silencing of those who dared to speak. By 1891, the plantation's fields lay fallow, its grandeur fading, but the family's secrets remained very much alive. The patriarch, Reverend Nathaniel Claiborne, had turned his home into a place of refuge for lost souls, or so he claimed. In truth, it had become a house of fear. His sermons spoke of salvation, but his punishments spoke of hell. It was under this roof that young Eliza came to live, an orphan taken in from a nearby mission school. No one questioned why the Reverend's wife refused to sleep in the same room as him, or why the servants avoided the attic after dusk. The locals said that when the wind blew from the north, the house groaned like it was mourning. Children dared each other to stand at its gates after dark, listening for the whispers that were said to drift through the trees. "They're calling for her," one old woman muttered at the general store, "the girl who hears them." But no one truly believed, not yet. Inside the house, time seemed to move differently. Clocks would stop without reason. Candles burned low, their flames bending toward invisible drafts. In the attic, where Eliza slept, the air was colder, unnaturally so. The walls bore scratches, symbols, and strange indentations, as if someone had tried to write with their fingernails. Reverend Claiborne dismissed it all as childish imagination. But late at night, when he walked past her door, he could hear her murmuring to someone, or something, on the other side. The mystery deepened when the Reverend's old records revealed something peculiar. Decades earlier, enslaved workers had reported hearing the same phantom voices, soft, rhythmic, sometimes calling names. Most were punished for speaking of it, some disappeared entirely. And though the tunnels beneath the house were sealed long ago, some swore they still heard footsteps echoing from below, followed by the faint sound of weeping. It's here, amid dust and decay, that the line between faith and fear blurred beyond recognition. Missouri was changing. Railroads, factories, and new laws promised progress. But for families like the Claibornes, the past refused to stay buried. What the world called superstition was perhaps memory refusing to die. And as night fell across the Missouri hills, the old house stood silent, waiting for the wind to carry the voices once more. Because this wasn't just a house haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by truth. And the closer one listened, the clearer it became that something beneath those floors still remembered every sin, every cry, and every name that was never supposed to be spoken again. Eliza was 13 the first time she spoke to the wind. She was small for her age, with a quiet strength that made her seem older than she was. Her hair was a dark tangle she could never quite tame, and her eyes, large, deep, and always searching, seemed to hold questions no child should carry. She had been brought to the Claiborne estate after the fire that destroyed St. Bridget's Mission School. The Reverend had called it divine providence. God has chosen her for redemption, he said. But Eliza did not feel chosen. She felt watched. The Reverend Nathaniel Claiborne was a man who believed that fear was the first step toward faith. His sermons drew crowds from miles away, people hungry for salvation, or perhaps for the spectacle of it. His voice could thunder through the church like a storm, but at home his silence was louder than any sermon. His wife, Eleanor, moved through the house like a ghost, pale, trembling, clutching a rosary that had long since lost its shine. She spoke little except to the servants, warning them never to linger near the attic after sundown. Then there was Samuel, the groundskeeper. A quiet man with calloused hands and sorrowful eyes. He had worked on the estate long before the war, back when the fields were alive with both cotton and chains. He treated Eliza kindly, leaving small gifts at her door. A feather, a stone, a wildflower, always with the same message: for protection. She didn't understand at first, but one night, when the voices came again, whispering through the cracks, she found the feather glowing faintly in the moonlight, as if shielding her from something unseen. Eliza's room in the attic became her sanctuary and her prison. She'd sit by the small window, tracing the movement of the trees as the wind passed through them. The whispers would rise and fall with the breeze, sometimes gentle, sometimes urgent, always calling her name. At first she tried to ignore them, but the more she prayed, the louder they grew, until she began to recognize tones, patterns, words. "Eliza," they breathed. "Listen." She began to write what she heard, small words scratched into paper scraps, phrases that made no sense. Beneath, "Forgive, don't forget." Samuel found one of the notes one morning, half buried beneath the loose floorboard near the kitchen. His face turned ashen when he read it. That night, he told her never to write them again. "Those ain't meant for you," he whispered. Those are the ones who never left. Despite the warnings, Eliza felt drawn to the whispers. They comforted her when the Reverend S. anger flared or when the house seemed to groan under its own secrets. She spoke to them softly, like friends, asking who they were. Sometimes the wind would answer with a sigh, sometimes with the faint sound of chains dragging across wood. In her loneliness, she formed a connection with something no one else could see, something that felt ancient and aching. And though she could not explain it, she knew the voices weren't trying to frighten her. They were trying to be heard. One evening, Eleanor Claiborne found Eliza asleep by the window. A single tear dried on her cheek. Her lips parted as though she had been whispering in her dreams. The woman's hand trembled as she touched the girl's hair. "You shouldn't listen," she murmured. "Once you start, they never stop." But Eliza's eyes fluttered open, and in a voice barely above breath, she said, "They already know your name too." From that night on, Eleanor stopped going upstairs altogether. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a rain-soaked night in October. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters until they banged against the walls. Eliza couldn't sleep. The voices were louder that night, clearer. They didn't whisper her name as they usually did. Instead, they called out a phrase she had never heard before, repeated over and over, woven through the sound of the storm. "Find the hollow," they said. "Find the hollow and remember us." She rose from her bed and lit a small candle. The flame flickered wildly as if resisting her. Barefoot, she crept across the attic floor. The wood beneath her feet was cold, swollen from years of damp air. She followed the voice to the farthest corner, where the wall met the slanted roof. There, hidden behind a row of rotting trunks, she noticed something strange, the faint outline of a door. Not a full-size door, but a small square panel, no larger than a window frame, sealed shut with wooden nails. Her heart pounded as she knelt beside it. She traced the edges with her fingers, feeling a faint draft seeping through. On impulse, she pressed her ear against the wood and froze. The whisper wasn't behind her anymore. It was coming from inside. Faint, rhythmic, like breathing. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping her candle. The sound stopped. Only the wind remained. The next morning, she told Samuel what she had found. His face tightened, and for a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke in a low voice, glancing toward the ceiling. "That ain't a place you should open, child. Some doors stay closed for a reason." He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "There used to be another part of the house up there, long before you came, long before even I stayed, but it was sealed after what happened." He wouldn't say what that was. That day, the air in the house changed. The walls seemed to creak more often, the doors to sigh when opened. Eleanor Claiborne, pale and tired, avoided Eliza's eyes altogether. When asked about the attic, she simply said, "Don't speak of it where he can hear," meaning her husband. But that night, when Eliza lay in bed, she could feel the vibration of the whispers through the floorboards, steady, deliberate, almost pleading. Unable to resist, she approached the hidden door again. The candlelight cast long shadows, twisting along the beams. This time she saw something she had missed before, carved faintly into the wood, almost erased by time, were several letters scratched by hand. E.C. Her breath caught. Her own initials, or were they someone else's? She touched the carving gently, and for the briefest second she felt warmth radiate from it, as if the wood itself had a pulse. The whispers rose again, softer now, closer. Then the candle went out. In the suffocating darkness, she heard the faint sound of a chain sliding across the floor, slow, deliberate, coming from behind the wall. She didn't scream. She couldn't. She stood frozen as the wind pressed against the attic window, and through the silence came a single voice, clearer than all the rest. "Eliza, we remember." And in that moment, she knew whatever slept behind that wall was waiting for her. By the following week, the house had turned against its own silence. Every night the wind returned, carrying whispers that slithered through the cracks like smoke. Eliza's once innocent curiosity began to curdle into fear, but the pull of the hidden door would not release her. She could feel its presence like a heartbeat under the floorboards, steady and patient. The Reverend noticed the change in her. He claimed she was infected by the devil's temptations and ordered more prayers, more isolation. What he called salvation felt more like punishment. At supper, the Reverend's voice filled the dining hall, preaching about obedience and sin. Eliza sat still, her eyes lowered, trying not to tremble as he spoke of voices that test the faithful. Eleanor Claiborne barely touched her food, her hands clenched in her lap, eyes flicking toward the window every time the wind sighed. When Eliza dared to glance up, she saw Samuel outside, standing near the barn, hat in hand, watching the sky like a man waiting for a storm that never ended. The Reverend had built his reputation on righteousness, but beneath that mask lay rot. His sermons about redemption were born from guilt of blood, of cruelty, of the chains once fastened by his own family's hands. He believed faith could cleanse the stains of the past, but faith had never been his to wield. It was a weapon he used to control. When the girl began to hear voices, he saw it not as a sign of the haunted, but as a threat to the lies he had spent a lifetime preserving. The whispers grew bolder. They no longer spoke only to Eliza. One night Eleanor awoke screaming, insisting she'd heard her own name echoing through the halls. The servants began to leave one by one, claiming the house was cursed. The Reverend called it weakness, but he too started to avoid the attic stairs after dark. Still, he blamed the girl. "You invited this," he hissed one morning after dragging her from her room. "You opened yourself to sin." That night, Eliza was locked in the old pantry as punishment. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. She pressed her ear to the wooden wall, and once again she heard them. The voices, gentle at first, then urgent. "He buried us," they whispered. "Under the chapel. The truth is beneath." Her pulse quickened. Beneath the chapel. She had never been allowed near that part of the property. When Samuel found her the next morning, pale and shaking, she repeated what she had heard. His face turned grim. "Don't say that again," he warned. "If he hears you speak those words, child, you'll vanish like the rest." But there was something else in his eyes. Sorrow mixed with recognition. He knew something terrible. The injustice of the house seeped into every breath she took. The Reverend preached forgiveness, while the earth beneath his estate was soaked in the unforgiven. Each lash of his discipline, each prayer forced through trembling lips, was another echo of the cruelty that had built his fortune. Eliza began to see it clearly. The voices weren't haunting her. They were demanding justice. They had chosen her because she could still hear what others refused to remember. That evening, the wind returned stronger than ever. It rattled the windows, whistled through the cracks, and in its mournful cry, Eliza heard the truth. The past was not buried. It was waiting to be unearthed. And somewhere beneath the Claiborne Chapel, the first secret of that cursed house was stirring, ready to be found. The storm arrived without warning. The sky turned the color of iron, and thunder rolled across the Missouri hills like a drumbeat from another world. Eliza stood at her attic window, watching the rain blur the fields into shadows. The whispers had not stopped for 3 nights straight. They came in waves, whispering fragments of names, fragments of pleas. Then one phrase began to rise above the rest, echoing like a command. "Go below. Go where he hid us." When dawn came, she could no longer resist. Barefoot, with only a candle and her trembling resolve, she slipped from her room. The house was eerily still, the kind of silence that feels watched. Each step down the stairwell groaned like a warning. She passed the Reverend's study, where a cracked Bible lay open on his desk, a faint smear of dried blood marking a verse about judgment. Outside, the storm had left the ground soaked and heavy. Eliza moved toward the small chapel behind the house, the place the voices had named. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the scent of mold and decay rose like a living thing. She hesitated only once before stepping inside. The candle flame danced wildly, throwing shadows across the wooden pews. The chapel's air was thick, almost sweet with rot. And then she saw it. A section of the floorboards near the altar, darker than the rest, warped as if by water, or something buried. Kneeling down, she pressed her hand against the wood. It gave way slightly beneath her touch. Her pulse hammered. Using a broken piece of iron from the old lampstand, she pried one of the boards loose. A rush of cold air rose from below, damp, earthy, and unmistakably human. She coughed, the taste of soil and something metallic filling her mouth. Then she saw it, fabric, torn, faded, and clinging to bone, a child's shoe, a length of chain, a fragment of a rosary. The candle trembled in her hand as her breath quickened. The realization came slow, terrible, and certain. This was not one person. There were many. The soil beneath the chapel was filled with them. The voices hadn't been haunting her. They had been calling her here. Behind her, the chapel door creaked open. Samuel stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, his face pale as ash. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped forward, his voice breaking. "I told him to stop," he whispered. "God help me, I told him, but he said they were sinners, said no one would miss them." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as she looked back into the hole. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. "The Reverend," Samuel said. "He buried them when the war ended. Freed souls, he called them. But they were never freed." The candle guttered as a sudden gust swept through the chapel. The voices rose together, no longer whispers, but a wail, a cry centuries deep. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath her knees. Samuel reached for her, but she didn't move. She could feel them now, hundreds of them, pressing against the walls of the earth, begging to be remembered. As the sound built into a low, thunderous hum, something cold brushed her arm. She looked down and saw a pale hand, impossibly small, reaching from the soil toward her light. The candle flickered once, then went out. In the darkness, the wind outside turned violent again, slamming the chapel door shut with a deafening crack, and over the sound of the storm, one voice rose clearer than all the rest. Calm, soft, almost human. "Eliza, you've found us. Now make him see." When the lightning flashed, Samuel's face was streaked with tears. He whispered a single prayer, but the girl didn't answer. She was staring into the black hollow beneath the floor, where the earth seemed to breathe, and where, at last, she understood what the voices had been trying to tell her all along. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the estate in deceptive calm, but beneath that fragile light, nothing felt the same. Eliza had not slept. The whispers had quieted after the discovery, leaving behind a silence far heavier than sound. She sat by her attic window, her hands still streaked with dirt, her eyes fixed on the distant chapel. Every time the wind brushed the trees, she thought she heard that single word again. See. Samuel avoided her gaze at breakfast. His hands trembled as he poured his coffee, eyes darting toward the Reverend's empty chair. The Reverend hadn't come down since dawn. The servants whispered that he'd locked himself in his study after hearing that the girl had been in the chapel. Eliza felt a deep unease twisting inside her. The voices had told her to make him see. But how? What did they want from her now? When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "He knows you went down there," he said. "You need to leave this place, child. Tonight." But Eliza couldn't. Not yet. Something inside her, the same force that had drawn her to the whispers, told her it wasn't finished. She had unearthed their bones, but not their truth. There was something else hidden, something deeper. That afternoon the Reverend summoned her. His study smelled of tobacco and damp wood. The curtains were drawn, the air thick with candle smoke. On the desk lay an old leather-bound ledger, its edges worn, its cover scorched by time. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. Eliza shook her head. He smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "This," he said, tapping the book, "is the record of salvation, the names of those who were cleansed beneath God's roof." He opened the ledger, revealing pages filled with neatly written names, dates, ages, initials. But the ink grew darker as the pages turned, the writing more frantic. At the very end, the lines were no longer words, but scratches, jagged and wild, as if carved by desperate hands. The Reverend's expression hardened. "You've been listening to lies, child. The dead deceive, they tempt." But Eliza's eyes locked on the last page. There, half buried beneath the scratches, were two letters she knew too well. E.C. Her heart stopped. "That's my name," she whispered. The Reverend's smile faltered. "It was another before you," he said quickly. "A girl taken in by our family long ago. A poor lost soul." His voice trembled slightly, the mask of control cracking. "She was chosen, as you are." Chosen. The word echoed like thunder in her mind. The whispers hadn't been calling to her, they'd been calling through her. The initials on the attic door, the voice that knew her name before she ever spoke it. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a cycle. Before she could speak, the wind burst through the chimney, scattering the candles. The room plunged into flickering shadow. The ledger's pages fluttered violently, stopping on one half-torn entry written in blood-dark ink. "The girl who hears them." The Reverend slammed the book shut and shouted, "Get out!" But as she fled the study, the voice followed her, soft, insistent, no longer many but one. "Eliza, remember me." And for the first time, she realized the truth. The voice wasn't from beneath the ground anymore. It was inside her. That night, Eliza could not tell where her thoughts ended and the whispers began. The storm had passed, but the air was still restless, humming with a kind of memory that refused to fade. She sat on the attic floor, surrounded by fragments of paper, old hymns, and torn Bible pages she had scavenged from the Reverend's study. Her candlelight flickered against the low ceiling, casting trembling shapes that seemed to breathe. Every so often, the wind would rattle the small window, and she'd hear it. A soft murmur, almost like the breath of someone kneeling beside her. Pieces began to fall into place. The initials carved into the wall, E.C., did not belong to her. Not truly. They belonged to another Eliza Claiborne, a child who had lived and died in that same attic decades earlier. She wasn't an orphan taken in by kindness, as the Reverend had claimed. She had been a servant's daughter, one of the last enslaved souls trapped in the estate long after freedom had been declared. She had heard the same voices. She had uncovered the same truth. And for that, she had been silenced. Eliza's pulse quickened as she pieced it together. The Reverend hadn't merely inherited guilt, he had preserved it. Every generation of Claibornes had buried their sins beneath the same roof, baptizing their cruelty in Scripture. The chapel floor was not the only grave. It was just the beginning. When the clock downstairs struck midnight, the current Eliza crept down the hallway, guided by that single whisper now echoing through her mind. The voice of the first Eliza, faint but determined. "He keeps their names," it said, "in the hollow, behind the light." She reached the parlor, the air thick with the scent of smoke and dust. The grandfather clock stood against the wall, tall and solemn. Behind it, she noticed a patch of wood, slightly brighter than the rest, recently disturbed. With trembling fingers, she pushed the clock aside. The wall gave a hollow sound when struck. A hidden panel. She dug her nails into the edges until it came loose with a low groan. Inside was a small recess filled with objects, relics of the forgotten. A cracked locket, a rosary, torn fabric marked with initials burned into the cloth. And behind it all, wrapped in oil-stained linen, another ledger, older, smaller, and bound in rope. The smell that escaped was sharp, almost metallic. She opened it. Page after page was filled with names, not of church members, not of converts, but of the dead. Each name had a mark beside it, a date, a note, sometimes a location. Under Chapel. By Well. Northfield. Her hand shook as she turned to the last entry. There, written in the same harsh scrawl, was the final confession. Forgive me, Lord, for the children who would not stay quiet. Her breath hitched. Children. Plural. She looked around the small hollow in horror. There were drawings scratched faintly into the wood, small, desperate sketches of hands reaching upward, of chains, of the moon. And there, at the very bottom, carved deeper than the rest, were words that froze her completely. The wind remembers. A sound behind her made her spin. Samuel stood in the doorway, holding a lantern, his face lined with grief. You weren't supposed to find this, he said quietly. I tried to seal it, years ago when the last one disappeared. Eliza's voice trembled. How many were there before me? Samuel's eyes glistened. 3, he said. All of them heard. All of them tried to tell, and every time the Reverend said he'd save them. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. But salvation, in this house, means silence. For a moment, neither moved. Then the wind howled through the cracked window, scattering the papers across the room. The candlelight flared, and for a heartbeat, shadows filled the walls, dozens of faint silhouettes, children's faces, blurred but watching. Eliza clutched the ledger to her chest, her heartbeat sinking with the rising hum in the air. The voice within her spoke again, stronger now, almost commanding. Show them, bring us to the light. And as the wind tore through the hollow, she knew what she had to do. She would expose everything the Claibornes had buried, even if it meant becoming one more voice the wind would never let die. The night the truth fully revealed itself arrived like a storm, ready to shatter the world. Eliza could feel it in her bones, in the way the wind clawed against the Claiborne estate, rattling windows and peeling paint. The voices had grown urgent over the past week, no longer whispers, but a chorus, insistent and commanding. Every night she dreamt of the children buried beneath the chapel and hidden hollows, their small hands pressing against the earth, reaching for her. She knew she had to act before the Reverend could erase the final pieces of their story. She descended the stairs cautiously, clutching the older ledger she had discovered in the parlor. Samuel had stayed behind, too terrified to intervene, yet he would follow if she called. The hallways were dim, lit only by flickering candlelight. Each door she passed seemed to hold a shadow, a memory, a silent warning. And then she heard it, the unmistakable creak of the study door opening. The Reverend had returned early from whatever sermon or meeting had kept him away, and his presence hit the air like a sudden gust. Eliza! His voice cut through the silence, both commanding and frightened. What have you done? Those papers, what are you holding? I'm showing the truth, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The children, the ones you buried, their names, their lives, everything you tried to erase, it's all here. He froze. For the first time, there was no thunder in his voice, only a chilling quiet. You don't understand, he whispered. I saved them. God guided me. Eliza felt the wind swirl around her, the chorus of voices lifting like a tidal wave in the shadows. Saved, she repeated. You buried them alive. You silenced every voice that spoke against your lies. These weren't sinners. They were children. And now they're calling on me to make the world remember. The Reverend staggered back, his hands shaking. His mask of control had cracked. You're like her. You hear them? Yes, she said. And I see everything. All the hidden hollows, all the graves, all the whispers you thought would die with time. But they didn't. They never die. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the study in a blinding flash. In that instant, Eliza could see it. The shadows of the children, their small forms hovering in the corners of the room, faces etched with sorrow and longing. They reached toward her, and she felt the warmth of their hands brushing against her own. The wind seemed to carry their voices through her veins, making her limbs tremble and her vision blur. The Reverend fell to his knees, the ledger slipping from his hands. He tried to speak, but the voices overpowered him, rising in unison, clear and unrelenting. No more lies, no more silence. The house itself seemed to react. Floorboards shuddered, the walls groaned, and the old chapel bell, long unused, began to toll, each clang echoing like the heartbeat of the buried. Eliza, trembling, opened the ledger and read aloud the names carved and written within, each syllable ringing with weight. Amelia, Joseph, Clara, Thomas. Hundreds of them, one by one. With each name, the shadows flickered and then became more distinct, the children's presence solidifying as if acknowledgement alone could give them substance beyond death. The Reverend raised his hands in desperation. Stop this! It is not your place. It is my place, Eliza said, voice rising, carrying authority she didn't know she possessed until that moment. They were silenced because of fear and greed. You hid them to protect your pride, but I will not be silenced. I will tell their story, and the world will know who you truly are. Outside, the wind roared like an army of the forgotten, tearing at the doors and windows. The chapel behind the house groaned, a low, mournful cry escaping the walls. And then, as if on cue, the hidden floorboards beneath the altar shifted. The earth trembled lightly, revealing the outlines of the graves Samuel had once tried to keep buried in secrecy. Eliza knelt by the nearest hollow, her hands pressed against the soil. The voices spoke through her now, no longer whispers but a single unified command. Remember us, speak our names, make them see. Tears streamed down her face, and the Reverend sank fully to the floor, unable to deny the living evidence of his deeds. The air felt electric, alive with memory and accusation. Eliza read each name aloud, the children's stories filling the room. They were no longer forgotten, no longer silent. Hours passed as she traced the ledger, the candlelight waning, yet she could feel the weight of the truth settling into the very walls. When she finally stood, exhausted, the shadows of the children had receded, but the warmth of their acknowledgement lingered. The house felt different. Lighter, though the horror of what had occurred remained etched into every beam and floorboard. Samuel stepped forward, voice shaking. They're free. Eliza looked toward the chapel, then at the ledger clutched tightly in her hands. They are remembered, she said softly, and as long as I live, I will make sure no one forgets. Their names, their voices, their lives, they belong to the world now, not to him. The Reverend's face was pale, his eyes wide with the understanding that centuries of deception had been undone in a single night. For the first time, fear overtook his pride. The girl who heard voices had become the vessel of truth, and the wind, carrying the cries and names of the long-forgotten, swirled through the estate like a declaration. History, no matter how dark, could not be buried forever. And in that moment, Eliza knew the final devastating revelation. The voices she had heard were not merely echoes of the past. They were guardians of truth, persistent and eternal, waiting for someone brave enough to listen, someone like her. In the days that followed, the Claiborne estate was no longer the same. The air felt lighter, as if the house itself had exhaled centuries of held-back sorrow. Yet the weight of what had been uncovered lingered in every corner, every floorboard, and every shadow. Eliza walked through the halls with a quiet reverence, the ledger in her hands, knowing that the names she had read aloud had shifted something in the very fabric of history. These were not just stories. They were reminders of the cost of silence, the cruelty hidden behind piety, and the lives extinguished before they could fully exist. Samuel stayed close, silent but protective, witnessing how the girl who had once trembled in the attic had transformed into a keeper of memory. Even Eleanor Claiborne, pale and withdrawn, seemed to carry a burden lighter than before, as though admitting truth, even silently, could ease the soul's torment. The Reverend, however, remained a shadow of his former self, a man confronted with the enormity of his deeds, realizing that no sermon could absolve him from the echoes of the children he had silenced. Eliza understood that the whispers were not punishment nor revenge. They were testimony. They were proof that even in the darkest corners of humanity, voices could persist and stories could demand to be remembered. Every name she had spoken was a life reclaimed, a fragment of history restored. In the quiet moments, she felt the presence of the children, their gratitude resonating not as words, but as a deep, unyielding pulse within her chest. The experience left her changed. She saw injustice not as abstract, but as living, breathing, tangible in the scars it left behind. The Claiborne estate became a mirror of the past, a place where the legacy of oppression and cruelty could not be hidden any longer. And yet, it was also a place of resilience, proof that truth, however long suppressed, would eventually find its voice. Beyond the walls of the estate, Eliza reflected on the broader history of Missouri, of the nation, and of humanity itself. For every child silenced, there were countless others whose stories had vanished without a witness. What she had uncovered was more than a local secret. It was a fragment of the larger, often unspoken narrative of systemic injustice, oppression, and the human capacity to both harm and endure. It was a reminder that history is never truly dead. It breathes in the whispers, the relics, and the memories that survive despite attempts to erase them. And in the stillness, Eliza realized that listening, truly listening, was a form of justice. By bearing witness to what had been hidden, by speaking the names and remembering the lives, she had fulfilled a sacred duty. History was no longer silent in the Claiborne estate, and though the pain of what had been endured could never be erased, the courage to remember had transformed it into something enduring, a lesson, a warning, and a call to conscience for anyone willing to hear. The wind that once carried whispers of fear now seemed to hum with quiet dignity, as if acknowledging that the past, though dark, had finally found its voice through her. And for the first time, Eliza felt the true weight of what it meant to be chosen, not to suffer, but to ensure that suffering would not be forgotten. If you've stayed with me this far, you've witnessed the voices of the forgotten rise from the shadows, demanding to be remembered. You've seen how one young girl, hearing what others could not, uncovered the hidden truths buried beneath the Claiborne estate. Truths that reveal not only cruelty and injustice, but also courage and resilience. Now, it's your turn to be part of this story. I want to hear from you. Which part of Eliza's journey struck you the most? The whispers in the attic, the hidden hollow beneath the chapel, or the final revelation of the children's names? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every voice adds to the collective memory, helping these stories survive beyond the pages of history. And if you feel compelled to uncover more forgotten tales of injustice, mystery, and dark history, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. By doing so, you'll join a community dedicated to exposing the hidden layers of the past, one story at a time. There are countless voices still waiting to be heard, and your curiosity ensures they won't be forgotten. Finally, if this story left you unsettled, fascinated, or even haunted, give it a like. It's a small action that helps these histories reach those who need to hear them. Together, we can shine a light on the corners of history that were never meant to see it. Stay with us, and you'll uncover secrets that even time tried to hide. Your journey into dark history doesn't end here. Comment, subscribe, and become part of the story. These voices need witnesses, and you can be one of them. As the night settled over the Claiborne estate, a quiet calm replaced the storm's fury. The wind no longer carried frantic whispers, but a steady, gentle murmur, a reminder that the voices had been heard, their names spoken aloud, their stories reclaimed. Eliza stood by the chapel window, the ledger still clutched tightly in her hands, and for the first time she felt the weight of what had been accomplished. These children, long silenced by fear and cruelty, now lived in memory, their truth no longer buried beneath the walls of the house. Samuel watched her from the doorway, his expression a mixture of relief and awe. He had been a silent witness to history, guarding secrets too heavy for anyone to carry alone. Now he understood that the past could not be erased, only acknowledged, and that acknowledgement carried a power stronger than any chains that had once bound the innocent. Eleanor Claiborne, still pale and fragile, remained upstairs, her eyes reflecting sorrow, but also a faint glimmer of hope. Even the Reverend, though broken, could no longer hide from the truth he had tried to bury. Eliza knew that the story of the Claiborne estate was far from over. For every secret unearthed, another lingered in shadow, waiting for the right ears to hear it. She had learned that history was alive, persistent, and patient. It would wait for those willing to listen, guiding them toward truths the world had long forgotten. And though she had uncovered one chapter of injustice, she could feel in her bones that there were countless others, hidden estates, forgotten tunnels, lost souls calling out for remembrance. The wind whispered again, softer now, almost like a lullaby. It carried the memory of the children, their gratitude, and their hope that someone would continue the work Eliza had begun. She pressed the ledger to her chest, feeling the pulse of the past within its pages. Each name, each story, was a promise that even the darkest deeds could not extinguish the need for remembrance. And so the night ended with a sense of quiet vigilance. Eliza knew she could not rest completely, for the world was full of shadows still, and the voices of the forgotten were far from finished. There were mysteries beyond Missouri, beyond the Claiborne estate, waiting in the dark, ready to be uncovered by those brave enough to listen. If you stayed until the end, remember this: every whisper has a purpose, every shadow a story. The past is never truly gone. It waits patiently for the ones willing to seek it out. And in the next tale, we will follow another forgotten voice, another hidden truth, another mystery long buried by time and silence. Prepare yourself, because the next story is coming, and it promises to reveal secrets so dark, so shocking, that you will never hear the wind the same way again. Stay vigilant and stay listening,